Hello there. This video was originally uploaded on my personal channel. If you like horror reviews plus videos discussing everything horror, please subscribe to Sunderland. There will be a link to the channel in the description and at the end of this video. Now let's get to this video. Let's go. When playing and reviewing a game, I always try to look at the developer's intentions. What was the developer trying to say or do? And were these intentions well executed? I feel like games that don't necessarily play well or have a good story can be elevated if the developer clearly achieves what they set out to do. But in some cases, a developer executing their intentions may take away from the overall experience when playing their game. Back in 1995 is an homage to PlayStation 1 era survival horror games such as Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Though, judging by what is present within this game, I would say the biggest influence is Silent Hill overall, which is extremely arousing for someone like me. Back in 1995 was developed by one person who loved survival horror and wanted to make a game that paid homage to those older titles. You would think this was the developer's intention, but when you see the credits roll, you realize those intentions did not provide something interesting, thought-provoking, or enjoyable like the game it is inspired by, and I'm going to get into why. The story of Back in 1995 is simple and starts off interesting enough. You play as a blocky man named Kent. He wakes up on a roof of an old building with the night sky consuming everything in the distance. All he can make out through the darkness are the flashing lights of a radio tower on the roof of another building. Kent does not know where he is or how the hell he managed to get on the roof of the building. All he knows is that he feels drawn to the radio tower. We don't know why this is the case, but Kent believes he needs to get to the radio tower because it may hold the answers to questions that haven't even been asked yet. So, the goal of Kent and the player is to get to the radio tower. Obviously, I've said that enough. Unfortunately for Kent, monsters appear out of nowhere. Why are these monsters here? Kent is not sure. He also runs into a cast of characters who are, of course, very cryptic. There is a doctor, a man who seems to be the last surviving member of a group, and a posh woman on the roof who seems to be expecting visitors for a dinner party. We have a wide variety of characters who feel out of place in this world, so that alone made me intrigued. You will also find notes scattered throughout the game that hint at what is going on, but they are vague and only provide the smallest of details. Even though you encounter these people and find these notes, the goal always remains the same: get to the radio tower. This premise is interesting. I love the idea of a character being drawn to a place, but they are unsure why, especially when the location which the player needs to get to is something that is seemingly normal. Like Silent Hill or the works of Junji Ito, I love when horror creators find fear in the mundane. Again, like Silent Hill, the cryptic nature of the characters and the notes makes me feel like something more is going on than what I initially thought. Everything just feels off, but that won't be explained until the end of the game, and I use the word explained very loosely. Besides that, the plot itself is bare bones at the best of times. Nothing really interesting happens, and nothing is really developed. All we know is, we gotta get to the radio tower, that's really about it. But there is nothing that carries the plot to its final destination. Having a goal is fine, but that is not enough to drive a story. I need more. I need it to engage me even in the most minimalist of ways, and Back in 1995 never does this. It just expects the player to be invested because it has somewhat of an interesting setup and because the game is a nostalgia trip. I can't explain why this is the case without getting into spoilers, which I will get into later, but trust me as a disembodied voice coming out of your computer or phone. This plot doesn't get any better and fails to understand why the plot of the games it is inspired by captivated so many people. For now though, let's just move on to the game. Thankfully, the visuals of Back in 1995 look pretty damn retro. One thing I really loved about this game is how it is displayed using a CRT TV effect, to mirror what it would have been like to play this game on an old television. The game is even displayed in an old CRT border. There are several levels of effect intensity ranging from none at all, just a little bit, which I used throughout my playthrough, and do you like having your fucking eyes ripped out of your skull? The effects make Back in 1995 feel really nostalgic for people who had one of those massive bloody TVs. It was a really cool touch and I appreciated the effort. Granted, they look better than any PS1 game, but they nailed that aesthetic nonetheless. The models and items in the environment look appropriately blocky and the textures are simple and blurry. This rooftop under construction is atmospheric and feels like a place you'd find out of a classic survival horror game. The developer did a great job creating and capturing that PS1 aesthetic. I did run into a few issues though in regards to texture warping. Some textures would greatly stretch and move while I was walking around. It really looked weird and took me out of the game, but luckily this rarely happened. Unfortunately though, the developer accurately recreated PS1 graphics, but didn't do anything interesting with them. The game takes place in a series of high-rise office buildings with some occasional moments where the player steps outside. Each of these areas are indistinguishable from the other. Indoor areas are brightly lit and consist of tight hallways and large offices with hardly anything of interest in them besides some notes and the occasional desk. Some areas have collapsed floors, but this only happens once from what I can remember, and it isn't really an obstacle as you just enter a room nearby and go around it. Rooms blend into one another, and I would always forget where I was and where I had been because everything just looks the same. Outdoor fares a little bit better, though not by a lot. There are these air vents everywhere, the occasional fence, and a couple of rusty stairs. Pretty standard survival horror stuff. The roof on the second building is the best as it is under construction, so it breaks up the monotony of the previous areas. The biggest thing that makes the rooftops at least somewhat atmospheric is the dark night sky covering any nearby locations. This can make even the most unimaginative places feel somewhat creepy. Overall though, there is nothing really creepy going on in these environments. I never saw anything gross or horrifying. Unless your worst nightmare is a 9-to-5 office job, you won't be scared by any of these environments. A lack of variety really held this game back, and it fails to capture the creepy atmosphere found in the games it is clearly inspired by. Back in 1995 is an old school survival horror game. So you have fixed camera angles, tank controls, limited ammunition and healing items, lots of doors, and of course, cranks. The tank controls back in 1995 feel extra tanky. I have recently played the original Resident Evil and Silent Hill, and their tank controls didn't feel as sticky and unresponsive as this game. Every movement feels overly deliberate and is extremely slow. You can play the game using the analog sticks, but I found that control method to be way too cumbersome, and the slow speed of the player character did not gel well with the fluidity of analog sticks. So I stuck with the D-pad and didn't have too many problems once I got the hang of it. One thing that is completely missing is a run button. All Kent can do is walk extremely slowly. Luckily this game is short and has hardly any backtracking, because I would rather finally write my fucking suicide note instead of being forced to watch this guy slowly walk through large areas over and over again. But what do you do when you're walking slowly from one place to another and back in 1995? Well, not a lot. Mainly the game consists of you meeting a character who asks you to grab a thing in order to progress. You slowly walk to a new area to grab said thing, walk back with said thing, and give said thing to the person who told you to grab said thing. It's probably not as tedious as I made it sound, but that is basically what the game boils down to. You would expect the developer to hide this mundanity through the implementation of challenging puzzles and enemies. Well, puzzles! There is like one. You need to move this green crate into this hole, but other crates are in the way, so you need to clear a path. Not terribly challenging, but that isn't the problem. An easy puzzle can exist if there are more puzzles, and those puzzles vary in difficulty. But this is the only real one in the game, and it is an easy sliding puzzle. What mainly constitutes as a puzzle back in 1995 is locks that need codes. You will see so many locks that need codes. Many other horror games have these types of puzzles, but they usually offer the solution in unique and sometimes complex ways. And if the game is really good, they will have these hints fit the themes or the atmosphere of the world or the story. But back in 1995, if you find a locked door, you can expect to find the solution basically in the next room. It is that easy. Puzzles are one of the biggest aspects of survival horror games, and the fact that a game designed to be an homage to those titles has some of the laziest puzzles one could expect is extremely disappointing. I was really hoping for something more engaging. Instead, I had to slide this green container into this hole. Oh, look, I did it. The other thing you do while slowly walking around collecting things for complete strangers and opening padlocks is surviving the horror. That horror being monsters, that survival being surviving. It is a pretty easy concept to grasp, so I don't know why I'm sitting here explaining it to you, but most of the enemy designs are pretty boring. You have a floating vagina, these chicken things, these hands reaching out of the ground for high five, and these bastards who I hate more than myself. The only enemy that piqued my interest because it looked as though some real effort went into its design was this big guy, who doubles as a boss fight. Oh, well, that was easy. Similar to everything else in this game, Silent Hill was a clear influence in these designs. But unlike those games where a lot of time and effort went into making them intimidating and interesting to look at, back in 1995's enemies look like designs in the early planning phase. I never felt scared running into these guys. Maybe they meant something to the player, a la Silent Hill, "Where's my wife?" but nope, they were just there because they needed to be because survival horror. But the enemies aren't here just to look pretty, so let's start talking about the combat. You have access to only a few weapons, which are a wrench, a pistol, and a shotgun. The wrench is used for whacking dudes while the guns are used for shooting dudes. Your best approach is usually trying to avoid enemies because you don't want to use precious ammo or run the risk of being damaged and having to use your limited healing items. When it comes to survival horror, this is pretty standard stuff and you're going to hear me say that a lot. I realized the problems I would have with the combat when I picked up the wrench for the first time and swung it. Yeah, attacking is super stiff and slow. I know this is the same in other games, but it seems to have been really exacerbated back in 1995. The time between me pressing the button to attack and the attack actually hitting the enemy is about 2 seconds. That is a major delay and makes timing attacks very difficult. Sure, I got used to it after a while, mainly by just not bothering with attacking, but when you are forced to fight back with a melee weapon, this 2-second delay can really fuck you over. Guns are not much better. I press the attack button and Kent takes his sweet time to pull up his gun and fire the thing. This nonchalant approach makes me think he isn't too worried about surviving, which is honestly something I can relate to. That is, of course, if the firing animation doesn't freak out when you pull up your gun. I mean, look at this shit. It didn't happen often, but when it does, it really looks weird and messes up the flow of combat. There isn't even a button to just reload your gun. If you have a full clip of ammo, you have to fire your last shot so Kent reloads his bloody gun. Now remember, this is a survival horror game, so every bullet counts. So doing this is a massive waste. I mean, you could just use the one bullet when you get into a fight, but now you have to sit through Kent's long as fuck reload animation, which can be interrupted when an enemy hits him. I had numerous times where I took hits because Kent decided he wanted to personally name every bullet he was loading into his gun. The combat just feels like it's overcompensating. The developer knew it had to be clunky, but instead of fine-tuning it to make it somewhat playable, they decided to make it as slow and janky as possible. Because, I've said it before, survival horror. The slow as fuck combat and Kent's movement speed is probably why the enemies are completely useless. Most enemies in this game move extremely slow. Even though Kent is also slow overall, his walking speed is faster than most enemies. This means the player can just walk around the enemies without breaking a sweat. They aren't intimidating or pose a real risk if they can't keep up with you. They just follow you in this little conga line until you leave the area. If you do find yourself close to these enemies, don't sweat. Just like Kent, enemies have an extremely slow attack animation, but an audio cue will go off when they are primed for an attack, and about 2 seconds later, their hit will actually land. This 2-second delay makes getting hit nearly impossible. Whether in tight corridors or wide open rooms, the player is never really under threat, which makes these enemies the least intimidating creatures I have ever encountered in a horror game. I get that this was probably done to complement Kent's slow speed and attack animation, but that doesn't mean the game won't pull some bullshit out to ensure that you will die. Firstly, let's talk about getting gangbanged. Now don't worry, you're not on Pornhub, so you don't need to freak out. Most of the enemy placements in the game are either random or placed near somewhere you need to go or something you need. The latter two examples are understandable, but the randomness of other enemy placements can really fuck you up. In the latter half of the game, you encounter these things. I fucking hate these things. Instead of moving slow, they are quick sons of bitches. Do they have slow attack animations? Nope. They are lightning fast. Do you encounter just one of them at a time? Oh, God no. 3. They come in 3s. When you fight them, does the level size accommodate for their speed and movement? No, it doesn't. You will fight them in tight rooms where they will sandwich you against the wall and fuck you up. They go against every design philosophy the other enemies follow. Even though I have problems with the lack of threat the other enemies pose, these guys are on a complete other side of the spectrum. They are not balanced for this type of game. Encountering these guys was the only time I truly hated something back in 1995. Thankfully, you can save at any time at one of these fancy 1995 computers, so any death should only set you back a few minutes. I'm usually against limited saves, but in the case of back in 1995, I wish they were here. It could have added some actual tension in a game severely lacking any. Though the enemies would have needed to be balanced and be placed in areas where they couldn't pin you in a wall and just fuck you up. God, this game is making me argue in favor of something I hate. I ran into 2 major glitches while playing this game. The first was this door. The prompt would not appear, so I thought I had to do something in this room to unlock it. I saw this painting with the number 4 in it, so I began trying to find a puzzle, but there was nothing. After aimlessly wandering around the room trying to figure out what I was supposed to do, I walked past the door again from a certain angle and saw the open prompt appear for a second. I tried to open the door like I had all the other times, but no prompt popped up. I realized I had to slowly walk next to the door and face a certain way for the prompt to appear. That was so annoying, as I wasted a good 5 minutes wandering around this bloody room, all because the game wouldn't let me open this door. The next was when the game shat itself. I just finished a section in the game in the late area where I had to walk around and slowly pick up notes that revealed some pretty cool parts of the story. As I collected the last note, this door unlocked. I walked to open it and nothing happened. I was stuck on this screen, but I could still hear myself walking around and shooting. The game had completely froze. I had to relaunch the game, slowly walk around and pick up these notes again, which made the story revelations lose their momentum, and walk through the door a second time, which thankfully worked. Considering this was the last thing I did in the main game, it was kind of lame to do it again, and it took away from the base ending. But now I want to talk about parts of this game that generally creep me out. One is kind of spoilery, but nothing to do with the plot or actual ending. It just takes place during the true ending of the game. The first time was when I walked into this random bathroom. Of course, since I was in a bathroom and I was playing a horror game, I expected something to happen. I walked in and this creepy music started to play. I was expecting someone to jump out and try and scare me, but that didn't happen. Instead, the screen cut to black and video 1 was displayed in the top right hand corner. It lingered for a bit and cut back to the bathroom where I just remained motionless and sat in the atmosphere. It was fantastic and generally unsettling. I love when horror games play on expectations that give you something you didn't expect. The second moment was during the true ending of the game. Again, no spoilers here. When you finish the fake ending of the game, it will put you back at the start, but you will have all your items and weapons. I went through the beginning area like I did before, but stumbled across a flashlight. When I picked it up, the world went completely dark and the only thing that was lighting my way was the flashlight. I was immediately reminded of the start of the original Silent Hill and I got so excited. I had to walk through all the areas I previously explored, but unlike last time where none of it was atmospheric or creepy, this second run through felt generally unsettling. The darkness swallowed everything and the limited light meant I never knew what I was going to stumble upon. Similar to the first scare, I didn't expect the game to do this and I loved exploring this world in complete darkness. Unfortunately, no new enemies or unsettling imagery appears, but I was just happy to be creeped out for once. But then I thought to myself, I wish the game was actually like this from the start. It makes replaying the same areas feel fresh, but this game badly needed some oppressive atmosphere, and knowing it does it so effectively, only if you get the true ending mind you, just shows how creepy this game could have been. The music in Back in 1995 is really cool. It uses a lot of haunting synth and ambient sounds that are simple but provide a unique atmosphere when exploring. Each song is very minimal, but I think that works. I would love to get my hands on the soundtrack to this game, as it would be perfect to relax and study to. The major shame with the music is that it's barely present. Most of the time you just walk around in complete silence. I think each song only goes for at least 10 seconds. Once that is done, you will just hear your footsteps. A lack of music can be used as a tool for reinforcing the atmosphere though. Sometimes you just need to let the player sit in the world you've created without any unnecessary audio distractions. As I mentioned before though, there is no ambient sounds, there are no interesting sound effects designed to unease the player. The world of Back in 1995 isn't scary atmospheric as is, so a clever audio design could have changed that. It's just empty, there's nothing going on. It is a major disappointment that this isn't the case. Luckily, the sound of the weapons are fantastic. When the wrench hits an enemy, it sounds super heavy and brutal, as though you are really fucking them up. The guns also sound solid. Each shot sounds super chunky. It made the weapons really feel deadly. When weapons in a game lack solid sound design, it can make them feel weak and boring to use. Though it takes ages for the player to actually hit an enemy in Back in 1995, when they actually do, it is violent music to my ears. One aspect of classic survival horror that this game nails is the voice acting. It is terrible, and I absolutely love it. Each character sounds stilted and as if the person voicing them has never done something like this before. It is exactly what I wanted, and when I ran into a character and they sounded like a text-to-speech program, I was ecstatic. I wish the characters had more screen time as most of the dialogue is delivered in text, but hey, I can't complain, but I am. If you paid attention to the notes, you may have realized what is going on with Kent. You may have refused to believe it, because it's cliche as hell, but deep down, you knew. The note talks about some person who has been admitted to hospital and is quite a violent patient. So I'm straight away thinking, all of this is some sort of dream, isn't it? Once you get to the so-called final level of the game, you find notes from your daughter, Elisa, whose name is a mixture of Alessa and the nurse Lisa from Silent Hill. She says you are actually in hospital for doing something bad. What is that bad thing? Who knows? The game never really tells you. The other notes you find are from more doctors, and these detail the big reveal, and also why the game is called back in 1995. Ken suffered some sort of brain injury and believes it is the year 1995. He's been in hospital for a while and cannot be shown anything after the year 1995, as he will freak the fuck out. Once he finds this out, we walk through the door that crashed my game. Kent finally reaches the tower and kills himself. The end. Or is it? No. But let's just talk about this first. This is one of the most cliche things a writer can do. The whole "it's all a dream" has been done to death and feels like a first-year creative writing student trying to sound innovative. When you combine the character just killing themselves, I feel like I just went to Subway and asked for the most played-out and cliched sandwich they could make, and when I got it, I still felt disappointed. I honestly couldn't believe this was it. But then the game restarted, and I knew it wasn't over. Was the game about to turn around? Well, aesthetically, yes, as I mentioned before, but plot-wise, abso-fucking-lutely not. While you're walking around in the dark, you find more cryptic notes that at first I thought would be hinting towards the main plot of the story. But after a while, all of that is forgotten and instead, you get this. That's right, it's the developer. The true ending of the game and the developer's real intent with this project is just, games aren't like they used to be, huh? I mean, obviously, because you made this and they were made ages ago, so of course, they're not going to be the same. I'm conflicted by this. On one side, I find it really wholesome that the developer is directly talking to the player and saying how games have changed and that this project was supposed to be an homage and a love letter to older titles. But on the other hand, I feel like it was a major letdown because I was expecting the main plot to finally be fleshed out. I was really hoping I would be shown something that made the plot come together and make the game worth playing beyond. Old survival horror games are great, but that is exactly what I got. If this was truly an homage to old school survival horror games like the developer clearly wants, there would have been more effort in telling an interesting and creepy story. This makes me think the plot was there purely because old survival horror games had those, and not because the developer had an interesting story to tell. Back in 1995 was a game made with the intention of capturing what made classic survival horror games so fantastic. And in some respects, it did that. Those games are held in such high regards by the players who love them, and we have seen a recent resurgence of developers such as the fantastic Puppet Combo, providing those players with something they can truly enjoy while hitting them in the sweet nostalgia, but not relying solely on it. Playing back in 1995 felt like the developer knew they wanted to make a classic survival horror game, but they didn't know what they wanted their game to be. Sure, it has all the hallmarks of the genre, but it doesn't have an identity. I can appreciate the love the developer has for the genre. I share that same love myself. So I don't hate this game or find it pointless. If you like those old games, I still honestly recommend giving it a go. I did enjoy my time with it despite all the negative things I've had to say. If the developer decides to make a sequel, I will definitely check it out because I feel as though titles like this should be supported. But I really just hope they do something more unique with it next time and add their own flair to the genre. I just feel as though so much more could have been done to make back in 1995 not only a homage to survival horror games, but a great survival horror game itself.